Hello, my name is Alice Butler-Walk and I'm from Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, and I'm presenting alongside Matthew Walk of the University of St Andrews. We're talking today about stones of empire and exclusion. So what do we actually mean by stones of empire and exclusion? Well, we're going to discuss our study and our paper on this topic, where we develop an argument that the choice of natural resources, the stones, that we use to build monuments, buildings, everything around us, is not neutral. We use a case study of Portland stone, which Matthew will explain more about, and we show how Portland stone is bound in meaning, and a very selective meaning at that. Portland stone, as Matthew will say, has been designated a global heritage stone resource, and we ask what the heritage of Portland stone actually is. Our argument is that thinking about Portland stone, and indeed other stones, through such a heritage lens gives a selective, and in this instance, oppressive view of the past.
So as Alice says, what we've chosen to focus our critique on is the concept of Global Heritage Stone Resources, or GHSRs. These are designated by a working group of the International Union of Geological Sciences, an umbrella organization of academic and industrial geoscientists. These geoscientists designate GHSRs on a range of criteria, which are listed here. But the key points to take home is that they make constant reference to a stone's link to human culture and to heritage without ever defining precisely what they mean by those terms, and also without any inbuilt critical consideration of culture and heritage. So we set out to critically determine how a building stone, an inanimate geological material, can become so imbued with cultural and national symbolism and power that it can merit this title of a GHSR. And we focused on the first GHSR, Portland stone, which was designated in 2013, in part due to its links to British architects like Christopher Wren and its use in war graves. Start off by explaining what Portland stone is. It's a white fossil-bearing limestone quarried from the Isle of Portland in Dorset, which is on the south coast of England. And it's been used in southern England as a building stone since Roman times, but its use in further afield, particularly in London, doesn't begin until the end of the reign of Elizabeth I and starts really with James I after the Union of Crowns. After the Great Fire, it is used prominently by Christopher Wren in the reconstruction of London, and particularly and prominently in the construction of St Paul's Cathedral. It's used extensively in the 19th century in the building of key administrative and cultural buildings associated with the British state and the British establishment. And around this time on the Isle of Portland, extraction of the stone for public building starts to take place via convict labour, which is a point that we'll return to. After the two world wars, it is used to construct the National Cenotaph, and it was used extensively and almost exclusively in the construction of war grave headstones in Britain and Northern Europe.
Given that the GHSR designation is so vague but simultaneously hits at this kind of economic and elite vision of the past and of Portland stone's use, we turn to Hansard to see how the story of Portland stone has developed. Hansard is the verbatim record of the House of Commons and House of Lords proceedings, and we sampled 88 entries from June 1815 to March 2013, and they were subject to a critical discourse analysis. So what did we find? Our first key finding was that Portland stone and the discussion of its use and value relies on and is part of the production of a mythologized British identity. This quote from MP Evelyn King, MP for South Dorset and therefore for the Isle of Portland, illustrates the type of narrative that was being perpetuated. King relies on reference to key buildings to exemplify the heritage of Britain, while simultaneously underscoring the commonality between all of these buildings that he mentions. They're built of Portland stone. If we dig into what King is describing, we see that he is elected to reference buildings of religious, academic, economic, and ultimately symbolic importance, and all in England, despite his projection to the scale of Britain. This is in line with Stuart Hall's description of heritage as being a material embodiment of the spirit of the nation and a selected, cherry-picked version of English virtues or Englishness that is constructed always by powerful elite voices and agendas. To further understand how the meaning of this linking of heritage, Portland stone and Britishness come together, we need to look further back in history. In the 17th century, as reconstruction work began on St Paul's Cathedral and the use of Portland stone was being promoted, we see documents and images highlighting England's place, and more specifically London's place, at the heart of the country and at the heart of empire. Narratives from this time frame show the development of London as the rightful building of a new Jerusalem. The language of God-given right to this mission is grounded in the recent union at this time of Scotland and England and the Reformation ongoing in Europe, and the need for James I to promote his newly united kingdom as a Protestant state with rightful claims to the creation of this new Jerusalem. Additionally, we see from this era art and documents reflecting the Roman foundation myths of Brutus that further fed into James's justification for the creation of a city fit for such an illustrious and rightful position. As James sought to establish his Solomon's Temple in London through St Paul's Cathedral, he needed a British stone and a Protestant stone at that to build from. Portland, which the Crown owned and could seize readily, was an ideal choice. But what is crucial here, however, is that there were other stones that could also have met this criteria. However, Portland stone was chosen and formed the foundation stone of a united kingdom, cementing its place at the heart of this mythologized Britain. It's this moment then that is referenced time and again when justifying Portland stone's status as an exemplar stone of the heritage of Britain.
Once Portland stone became imbued with this sense of Britishness, its use in areas outside Britain that are under imperial governance starts to resemble an attempt to transplant British identity and culture. In Ireland, this practice was supported by protectionist export policies and by a lack of investment in Irish infrastructure. For instance, per tonne, it cost about half as much to bring stone from Portland to Dublin than it did to bring an equivalent limestone to Dublin from a quarry 40 miles west of the city. Its use in late 19th and early 20th century Dublin is highly contested in Hansard and in the press. In Ireland, a narrative builds that the use of Portland stone is unpatriotic. After partition and the formation of the Irish Free State, the new government in Dublin uses a local stone to repair key public buildings, sometimes leading to a colour mismatch, which is seen here at the bottom of this slide with Customs House, where the darker grey dome has been local stone and juxtaposes with the white Portland stone facade. As well as transplanting Britishness and building key administrative buildings in an English or British stone, doing this stops any native Irish stone from becoming imbued with the same symbolic power of national identity. Coming back to the earlier point about convict labour quarrying Portland stone, this also links back to why the stone was resented in Ireland, where it was often known as a, quote, convict stone. Irish political prisoners opposed to British rule, including actually a number of MPs, were interned at Portland and helped quarry and dress the stone that was then shipped to build imperial buildings in Dublin. And this policy is well documented in Hansard from the 1850s into the early 1900s. So this practice throws up major issues when GHSRs are uncritically linked to, quote, significant buildings. We must ask who was quarrying the stone at the time, who was building these buildings, and what was their motivation. Regarding Portland stone, it seems clear that there were elements of cultural oppression at work.
So as Portland stone becomes imbued with mythologized and idealized notions of Britishness, and as it was transplanted in Ireland and in other sites of empire, we must also note another key finding. Portland stone was not for everyone. It was to be enjoyed and viewed by only Britain's elite. It was then not only a stone of empire, but of exclusion. This top quote here highlights what Conservative MP Alfred Marples viewed as a waste of money when Portland stone was used and appreciated only by workers at a copper works in Yorkshire. This, he argues, does not constitute value for money, and it connects with this ongoing debate about the use of Portland stone in great buildings. buildings of note and importance. While we see that labouring bodies quarry and dress the stone, it is elite voices and elite eyes who consume the stone, transplant it, dominate with it, and demarcate their exclusive position through its use. As Matthew mentioned earlier, Portland stone is the material of choice for war graves and has been used in the cenotaph in London and in replicas around the world, and can be seen as a stone of remembrance. But in this remembering, we must ask who is being remembered and note the exclusionary nature of its use yet again. The erection of a war grave headstone has been shown by Michelle Barrett to be deeply political and reinforces colonial and oppressive narratives. Thousands of African soldiers who fought for the British Empire and who sacrificed their lives were listed as missing, and no headstone was erected. For white, British, Christian soldiers, and for higher-ranking officers from colonised nations, a headstone would be used or some form of permanent Portland stone marker erected, even when the soldiers were missing, lost at sea, for example. But for the rank-and-file soldiers fighting for Britain from a colonised nation, they were denied their name being inscribed on a single headstone. Instead, and at best, they are listed together on one single memorial, as it would, as archival documents highlight, be, quote, a waste of money to remember them through stone. Thus we can see that Portland stone is a stone of remembrance, but it's exclusionary and remembers only certain lives. So we shall leave you then with a few final thoughts. Portland stone is widely used, but as we've shown today, it is a stone that symbolises and underscores empire, oppression, and exclusion. It's used to build a mythologised and elite geography and identity that can then be transplanted elsewhere. When Portland stone is celebrated for its heritage status, we must then ask who is constructing that heritage narrative, and ultimately we must think critically about our built environment. Who constructs our towns and cities? What are they using for construction? And importantly, why are they using that material? Thank you.